All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Prodigy program here today for your this lesson that we're having here today. This is FIDE Master Dalton Preen. Let me first of all let me know in the chat box if you guys are able to see the board, hear the audio, and we'll get started with our 1200 section lesson in about a minute or so. Hello, Gulval. Oh man, some of these names are gonna be a little tricky. Throw Ghirardelli, it looks like. Di Cheskow, Kuyar, Jindok, Sergey is smart. Nice to see all of you guys here in the chat box today. Thank you very much, DI Cheska. Audio and video is good. All okay from other people as well. Apopka. See the board and hear the audio, but shouldn't the chat also be in the vid? I'm going to turn on the chat box once we get started in just a moment. Just keeping the little overlay on the right side for the moment until we begin with the actual lesson. Yeah, you will see the chat box on the screen momentarily. So I think everybody's pretty good with the audio and video. Once again, if there's any kind of issues here with the stream, make sure that the video is not muted for whatever reason. You can try refreshing the web page, whether you're on the Chess University website or if you're on the Twitch.tv website. You doing one of those, one of those things will usually fix any kind of issues that we might have with the technical side of things. Okay, so let me go ahead and flip the chat box on real quick, just to make sure that we can all see that. Boom, there you go. Okay, so once again, though, hello everybody. My name is Dalton Preen. Just to introduce myself real briefly, I am a FIDE Master as well as the Director of Instruction for ChessUniversity.com, as well as one of the lead instructors for the Prodigy program, and I would like to welcome you all to this introductory live lesson for the 1200 section of the ChessUniversity.com Prodigy program. So just for a little introduction, if maybe some of you guys were in the 900 lesson that was a little bit earlier, maybe you've already heard this little bit of introduction, but for those of you who this is your first lesson with Chess University, for example. For those of you not familiar with us, Chess University is the world's first live online chess academy. We offer structured online courses, we offer chess in schools programs, and other educational chess offerings to students around the world. So that's a little bit of an introduction about myself as well as Chess University. Now let's get into our lesson that we're going to be talking about today. So in this lesson today, for the 1200 section, we're going to be talking about the soul of chess, which is the pawns, and how they can be involved in different forcing situations. Now, forcing situations plus pawns can be a little bit of a tricky subject sometimes when you combine the two of them. What are some things about pawns that differ from some other chess pieces? There's a couple of specific things that pawns are a bit different with compared to some of the other chess pieces. Maybe some of you guys can list some of the differences here. And we'll talk about how that connects with the forcing aspect. Okay, they can promote. They're the only piece they can promote. That's absolutely true. Salam says there's 8 of them. That's absolutely true as well. 8 pawns compared to most other pieces there's 2 of, and then of course the king and queen there's 1 of on each side. You can't move backwards. That's a very important thing that we're going to talk about, especially in regards to the forcing move idea that we'll be talking about throughout this lesson. There's the en passant idea. They can only go forwards and capture diagonally. They're the weakest piece, typically. Okay, very good. So for the most part, the main thing that we're going to keep in mind as this lesson goes on is that pawns cannot go backwards. Whenever they move to a square, whenever you advance a pawn, you have to be certain it's a good move and that it will have little or no drawback or consequence. So, again, one principle to keep in mind with the pawns is that every time you move them forward, you're giving up control of certain squares in exchange for controlling new squares. So let's say, for example, I have a pawn on e2, let's say right here in the middle of the board, and I move this pawn up to the e3 square. Let's even say just one square the pawn moves. What was this pawn previously controlling that it's no longer controlling? And what is it now controlling, that's new? Even just this one little pawn move. And again, this will tie into the overall aspect of the lesson in a moment. What's going on with just this one square pawn move? Okay, so Throw says d3 and f3. It was previously controlling the d3 and f3 squares. Absolutely correct. And now it's no longer controlling those squares. It is now controlling the d4 and f4 squares instead. So the reason this is important is because, let's say, for example, we make a certain pawn move in a game. Because the pawn cannot move backwards, we want to make sure that we're not giving up control of the squares or giving our opponent control of squares those squares that were going to be important. Maybe these d3 and f3 squares were important for some reason, and moving the pawn forward and no longer controlling them has some kind of drawback in our position. Now, obviously, this is a very basic example. This is only move number 1 of a game, but we'll see how this ties in with some more of the examples that we look at a bit later and throughout the lesson. So the main thing, though, is that when we're thinking of making forcing moves with our pawns, when we're thinking about making any pawn move in general, we have to always consider the advantages and disadvantages of the move. Because compared to the other pieces, if we realize that we made a mistake with our pawn move, well, other pieces you could move the piece back a bit later, but pawns cannot erase their mistakes. If you make a pawn move, you can't go backwards and fix your mistake possibly. You got to just kind of live with what you've done already. So let's go ahead and look at a couple of examples of some forcing pawn moves. And, well, even right before we look at those positions, when we're talking about forcing moves in chess, what am I referring to? A forcing pawn move. How would you explain the difference between a normal pawn move and a forcing pawn move? Okay, so Throw says forces the opponent to move a certain way. Okay, that's definitely true. A forcing move is forcing the opponent to react in some way. MC Junior 88 says the opponent must react to prevent a loss. Very good. Yes, Kasparov Sito. This is the 1200 class. Forces the opponent to respond. Possibly if it's a pawn check or if it's a promotion. Real Moon Master has kind of along those ideas as well. Okay, good. So generally, the pawn moves we're going to look at throughout this lesson are going to be forcing moves. We're going to be evaluating different types of forcing pawn moves, but not all forcing pawn moves are created equal. Some of them will be good, some of them will be bad. There might be some situations where we shouldn't move a certain pawn to make a forcing move. We'll definitely look at a variety of situations throughout the lesson here today. So let's go ahead and play out an example position here. Let's say the game starts off with e4, e5, let's say knight f3, d6, d4, pawn takes, knight takes, and let's say we're playing black here. And let's say that black in this position is thinking about a forcing move. He's thinking about the move c5. Now, first of all, why would this be considered a forcing move? Why would moving the pawn to c5 be forcing here? Okay, it threatens the knight, attacks the knight, forces the knight to move, so it's forcing white to respond, because if we make this move, if we make it, white will need to move the knight. If white doesn't move the knight, then we're generally going to capture the knight. But let's say, first of all, we're thinking about this move. Especially when we're moving pawns, one question that black here should ask himself is, what are the advantages and the disadvantages of this pawn move? Because remember, with pawns, you can't undo your mistakes, or you can't undo your moves. So you got to make sure that the move is going to have more advantages than it's going to have disadvantages. So first of all, what are the advantages of this move? Even aside from attacking the knight, we've already stated that. What else does the move c5 do? Okay, it does attack the center a little bit, because the d4 square, even if the knight wasn't on d4, it's still aiming at the d4 square, which is one of the 4 central squares. That is true. Opens up some lines for the queen to possibly move out, because there's no longer a pawn on c7. That's true as well. Gets us a little bit of extra space. Okay, so there are a couple of advantages to this move. However, let's also ask ourselves the same question in the opposite of it, though. What are some of the disadvantages of this move? And remember, when you're thinking about moving a pawn, you also have to think about what squares do we give up control of when we play this move c5. So I really appreciate all the answers. I'm going to try to look at it as many as I can. It's going to be hard for me to get through every single one. Let's see here. Disadvantage, black will no longer be able to cover d5 with the pawn. That's absolutely correct. Once the pawn has reached the c5 square, it can no longer protect d5. There's no pawn. We can't move the pawn back to c6 to cover the d5 square. And also, we don't have an e-pawn anymore, so there's no e-pawn to cover the d5 square. So d5 would be pretty weak if we make the move c5. You're absolutely correct about that. Let's see. No longer protects d6 and creates a backward pawn. That's true as well. d6 would be a bit weaker after the move c5. Absolutely correct. Because no pawn can cover d5, it's now a good outpost square for white. Definitely true. Okay, so there's a couple of upsides, but there's also some downsides here. So in this position, how would you evaluate this move? There's some advantages, there's some disadvantages. We're giving up control of certain things. We're hitting the knight, though, on the other hand. We're controlling the center a little bit. But we are giving up the d5 square and weakening our d6 pawn, for example. What do you think about this move? Do you think it's a good move? Or do you think it's not a good move? Okay, so it looks like the overwhelming majority so far is saying that it's not a good move, not the best move. And I would agree with you guys in this situation. c5 does threaten the knight, so there's an upside. But as soon as the knight moves away, let's say the knight goes to, I don't know, back to f3 or something like that. Other than gaining a little bit of extra space in the center, which it is true, the pawn on c5 does control a little bit of the center, this move has a lot more drawbacks ultimately. Obviously, our opponent's going to move the knight. We can't just hope or assume our opponent's not going to move the knight. I think we're at a strong enough level where our opponent's not just going to let the knight get captured for free. But the main thing is we weaken a lot of our position. d5 is now a great outpost, like was mentioned earlier, for one of white's pieces. White could easily play knight c3, knight d5, and jump into that square very quickly. Also, the d6 square is a lot weaker. White could play bishop f4, maybe queen d2, get a rook behind the queen, and maybe, pile up on that d6 pawn potentially. And other than gaining space, we haven't really benefited our position at all. We didn't develop a piece. We are controlling the center a little bit, but really this move c5 is not really helping our position very much. So in this case, if we're, this is what most of the focus of the lesson is here. Even though c5 is a forcing move, and generally, we want to look at forcing moves and think about forcing moves a lot of times when we're playing our own games because they make our opponent react to them. That doesn't mean that every forcing move is a good move. In this situation, c5 has more downsides than upsides, so c5 would not be a very good move in this position. Now let's look at a different position. Let's say we have a new game here. Starts off in a different way. Let's say it starts off with e4, d6, d4, c6, f4, knight to d7, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g4, g6, bishop goes back, bishop g7. Okay, so let's say this position, for example. So in this position here, white is thinking about playing the move. Oh, let's see, the audio just changed. Yep, hold on. Are you guys able to hear me okay? Let me know in the chat box real quick. Sounds fine? Okay. Maybe it's just some things with other people. Okay, sorry about that. Just want to make sure you guys could hear me. Okay, so let's say in this position here that we're thinking about making the move pawn up to e5. So again, first question, why would this be considered a forcing move? Do I want to be your friend on chess.com? If you want to send me a friend request on chess.com, I'm more than happy to accept it. That's fine. Okay, so Real Moon Master says it attacks the knight. Kolb says it threatens the knight on f6, gains space and attacks the knight. Okay, so it's threatening the knight. So in a way, you know, both e5 in this position and c5 in the other position, both of them were threatening a knight. Or, you know, threatening a piece. They just happen to be a knight both times. So we're threatening the knight on the s6 square here. So it is a forcing move. It requires black to react to it. Now we're asking the same question, though, again. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this move? What's the good and the bad of this move here? There are some advantages, there are some disadvantages, but we're going to see if, you know, if one outweighs the other. That's ultimately what we're trying to figure out here. Hey, Yeehaw, we're just talking about evaluating forcing pawn moves, and we're looking at some different examples here. For those of you who are, you know, just getting into the lesson right now. All right, so let's see what you guys are saying. It's Rao says it's a good move due to full control for white of d5, so the knight can't go there. That is an important thing that we'll talk about in a moment. Very good to notice that. Creates a hole on e4. A little bit. E4 is a little, I guess, in a way, a little weaker because there's nothing on e4, technically. Let's see. Disrupts the black center control and pawn structure. That is true. Good is it doubles black's pawns or pushes back the knight. Okay. And here it's a good move because we gain space and take control of the e5 square and hinders black's pieces. We weaken d5 and f5. King is left exposed. Good move. Pretty good move. Good, threatens knight. Bad, not castling or developing. Okay, so in this position, remember, whenever you're making a pawn move, no matter what pawn move it is, you're giving up control of certain squares in exchange for controlling new ones. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is up to you to figure out. So if we do make the move e5 in this position, we're hitting the knight. We already recognized that. We are giving up control of the d5 and f5 squares if this pawn moves forward. That is absolutely true. However, the nice thing is here, the knight cannot actually go into the d5 square. Yeah, Ari, I am Maddie D. Praying on chess.com. Yep. The nice thing is here, though, the knight can't use the d5 square if we do push the pawn forward because we do have pretty good control of d5. For example, if we do push the pawn and the knight goes there, we can actually just go ahead and capture the piece. You have to be a little bit careful with how you capture it. There are actually some little tactics to be careful about. Knight takes d5 and bishop takes would actually not be good due to queen a5 check here. But you could do bishop takes first. Bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes, check, bring the knight back, and you're up a pawn. So that's pretty good for white here. Ultimately, though, the knight can't go to d5, so where is the knight going to have to move to in this case? What are some other spots the knight would, you know, move to at this point? Okay, Kasparov says back. Kolb says g8. Real Moon Master also mentions h5 as well. h5 and g8. Okay, so pretty much here, h5, g8. We can actually rule out h5 pretty quickly. If the knight goes to h5, what can we do about this? Yeah, Elster has the idea. Throw Hunter. Yep. So the idea here, the knight on the rim is, you know, grim. That's kind of the saying. We can make the move g4, and now the knight's trapped. Our king is definitely a little bit weak here because we've moved the f and the g pawns, but we're going to win a piece ultimately. Then we're going to win the knight. We're going to be up material, and then we'll fix our king position, you know, pretty soon as the game goes on. So h5 doesn't really work. We can rule that one out. The knight would ultimately have to go back to g8. Whether black took on e5 first or not doesn't really matter. I guess if he takes, we can just take back with the d or the f pawn. Either one's pretty good. Let's say the d pawn. Open up the queen a little bit. But the knight's going to have to go back to g8 ultimately. Now, because the knight's been pushed back to g8, we've gained extra space with this move e5. We've hit the knight. We forced him to undevelop a piece in the process. Now, we have given up control of d5 and f5, but in this case, do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages? What do you think? Is this a good move ultimately, or is this a not good pawn push? Okay, so ultimately this is a good move here. I was just waiting for some more answers to roll in. So ultimately, I would say that e5 is a pretty good move. There are some downsides, of course, but ultimately we've kicked the knight back. It's not developed. We gained extra space. Like some of you guys have mentioned, we could follow up with a move like e6 as well. We've blocked the bishop out. We could also just continue developing if we wanted to. Ultimately, this is a pretty good position. Yeah, I'm sorry about the dog in the background. I had to mute for a quick second. Sorry about that. But ultimately, I would say that this e5 pawn push is a good example, a good example of a forcing pawn move. So this case, e5 would be good. Now, does that mean you have to play the move e5? Not necessarily. It's not the only move in the position by any means. You could also just continue developing the knight. You could go ahead and castle if you wanted to. But e5, if we're thinking about that move, it does end up being a reasonably good move or option in the position. Okay, let's look at another situation. We're going to look at one more and then move on to kind of a full game example. Maybe one or two more positions, then move on to a full game example. So let's go ahead and say, for example, well, let's start up a new game. Let's say here, let's say the game goes d4, d5, c